Vacancy and absorption forecast gets you to where we think we might be going here. One thing I wanted to point out before we get to the right-hand side and talk about this year's end results, hopefully, is I want you to just focus on the three peaks, or not quite the third peak yet, but the two prior peaks. And we see this downward slope. Back in the early 90s, we had a very severe jump in vacancy here. Of course, that was a result of a lot of new construction in the city. We had a more muted peak in the 04-05 thing, and now it looks like we may be even headed toward a more muted peak here in this cycle. So, as I mentioned at the outset, we think one of the things that's actually going on here, and what's causing this to be a more stable market through the downturns, is the fact that if you look back at Philadelphia's history in terms of who was here and the space they occupied, and you go back to names that have disappeared, core states, for example, probably at one time had 2 million feet in the downtown. Well, the remnant, as Jim Egan referred to in Wells Fargo, is now maybe down to 500,000 or 600,000 feet or 700,000 feet. So Philadelphia early on had these large installations of space here. IBM's another one with 500,000 feet in the downtown, and now it's virtually zero. So when the downturns hit in the prior cycles, we had enormous occupancies that were affected dramatically, and in some cases, in IBM's case, for example, 100% sublet for all intents and purposes. Obviously, we've morphed beyond that now, and if you look around the city, we believe, if you did the math, the average size of tenancy in the city has now diminished. The number of gorillas that are out there that occupy large quantities has diminished. And therefore, when we get a contraction cycle underway, yes, we still have the same effects, everybody contracts, but you don't have the exposure that we did in the past to 500,000, or in the case of Conrail being bought, 750,000 feet disappearing. So despite what we showed you in the slide about the major companies that had a severe impact on our vacancy picture this past couple of years, because they're smaller and the city has become diverse, the actual down cycles here look like they're starting to kind of level off and be a lot less volatile. That's a good trend in terms of going forward, obviously a good trend for landlords. All right, got to the forecast. Here's what we see for this coming year, and this first number was really a great debate internally. We had a very strong fourth quarter of 010, as you just saw. Surprised us. I think it was probably surprising many of you. So the question is, you got a national economy, a regional economy that still is kind of sputtering along, but we're all talking about signs of positive things happening. We've got a history of 4-year down cycles that is pretty solid and pretty consistent. But this one looks like it may be a little different. So we debated flat, we debated positive 100,000. We finally decided that, kind of based on the solid history, we didn't think we were quite strong enough to come out of the woods, so we settled on negative 100,000 feet. I will tell you that in the deals we're tracking right now in the marketplace, if I add the contractions along with the growth we're seeing, there's about 125,000 feet of positive growth buried in the transactions that are walking around town right now. So it's quite possible that although we're being a little conservative by staying on the negative side in light of the down cycle history, this number could flip over and be on the positive side by the end of this year very easily. So we're kind of optimistic about it, and we're kind of hedging our bets, but we think this is going to be a turn the corner here for the city for certain. If it goes to negative 100, we're just going to have a slight blip up on the vacancy. 14.2 now goes to 14.4, so hardly a change there. Rental rates pretty much bouncing along, we believe, right now at the bottom. The only reason we use the downward word here is because the moment there still isn't enough velocity of transactions in this marketplace, I think, or we think, to give tenants or landlords comfort that if they don't lease it to this tenant, there'll be another one through in 3 weeks and we'll lease it to them. What that gets is a cycle of, well, we better do this deal now because we're not sure when the next one's getting here. And that tends to drive rates down as you get a more frenzied competition for a particular transaction. This is particularly the case at the moment with high credit transactions, which we talked about. So our hope is that we've hit bottom and the velocity picks up and landlords get a sense that they don't have to constantly chase every deal and be more aggressive with their rates. But we'll have to see how that kind of goes. And then here's the real surprise, and the new construction category, where all of us are probably thinking, well, there's just no way. Well, we believe, and we probably know, that there will be some new construction in Philadelphia this year. It won't be a massive tower, but there will be new construction in the city. So that just holds your breath and watch it happen. Deal metrics, capital have-nots. In general, there's probably still more haves than the have-nots out there. But capital clearly is a huge number in these transactions still. To give you one example, even though there were two parties contributing to this capital, the Marshall-Denny deal that we've talked about a couple times, $80 a foot in capital for that firm to build new law office space. That's kind of a new record in the last couple of years. Arkema contributed half, the owner contributed half, voila, the firm walked away with a huge number. But it is not untypical to see $45, $50, even up to $60 in the credit long-term transactions that are moving around the city. Some landlords have that ability to reach for those numbers, others do not, so it is kind of a mixed bag. Extensions of term, we talked a couple years ago when the recession first started about the Band-Aid deals. You know, firms that would normally do 5 suddenly were doing 1 or 2. Firms that were typically 10-year firms were suddenly doing 5s. You know, again, just didn't know what the future was going to look like. Band-Aid over, deal with it later. That is totally reversed. We've now seen firms pushing terms out even beyond 15 years. Now, clearly, FASB 13 and GAAP accounting and all that may start to affect that. I'm personally involved in one transaction where FASB 13 just stopped it flat and looks like it's backing it up from 15 to 10 years. So there are some things going on there that may mute this extension of term. But clearly, for a while there, it looked like tenants wanted to grab for long distance in terms of signing on. Renewal percentage, this is typically in Philadelphia what we see is 50% of the tenants renew, 50% of the tenants move. Again, when the recession got underway, there was a quick change in that, and renewals were the favorite event. Again, unknown future, let's just hold the fort here and we'll deal with it later. That trend is now, there's probably 40-60 there in favor of 60-40 in favor of renewals. That's now flipped because the relocate and aggressive deals are out there, the heavy capital numbers are out there. Tenants are now more predisposed to relocate than renew. And the numbers actually almost flipped over perfectly. Free rent, still with us, still large in a lot of cases. But it does depend a lot on the size of the transaction and, again, the length of the term and the credit, particularly of the tenant. And renewals clearly don't garner anywhere near the free rent that a relocation transaction does. And then finally, on the net effective rents, which Matt talked about, renewals are still stronger than relocates. They have been declining a bit, but by and large, because renewals don't usually require the same amount of capital as a relocate, the landlord's net effective return can be much better. Relocations, again, back to the same issues of velocity. Landlords chasing credit deals. These can get very, very skinny. In fact, we've seen some negative net effective rents fly around occasionally. We don't think this is a trend, but because of the velocity out there right now, it's still possible, but I don't know how long that's going to last. That ends my section. Hopefully that's certainly more optimistic than we were last year, and we'll keep our fingers crossed it all works out that way. Before I introduce my good friend, and actually the second mayor, I think, of this city, Paul Levy, I have to extend Drew Becker's regrets for not being here. We had the great idea of linking the new Chicago guy in town, who is now president of Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, with Paul as kind of a neat tandem to talk about green, sustainability, infrastructure, those type of issues. Unfortunately, Drew had a slip and fall on some ice, I think, about 2 weeks ago, and ended up cracking 2 ribs. So as of this morning, there was too much pain to come in here and talk, but he extends his regrets, and we'll have him back soon. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Paul Levy, President and CEO of the Center City District, and he'll talk about a number of the things that are underway in the city for green, sustainable, and I guess infrastructure.